Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome. Welcome. My name is Jim Anaya. I'm the Dean of the University of Colorado Law School. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the inaugural Ruth Wright Distinguished Lecture in Natural Resources. This is actually the 5th edition of this distinguished lectureship, although it did not before bear the name of Ruth Wright. The inaugural lecturer was Bruce Babbitt, I believe, but we're very happy that it is to now designate the Ruth Wright Distinguished Lecture Series. We're all excited for launching this endowed lecture series. And I want to begin by extending our appreciation on behalf of the Getches-Wilkinson Center and the law school community as a whole to the Wright Family Foundation for starting the endowment to ensure a long and sustainable lecture in this series. Thank you. And we're so very grateful for the opportunity to honor our illustrious alumna, Ruth Wright. Thank you. And so, again, we'd like to recognize Ruth, Ken, other members of the family who are here with us this evening. Thank you so much for this lecture series. And of course, we're thrilled that the inaugural lecture will be presented by Professor Lisa Heinzerling from Georgetown Law Center. We couldn't think of a more fitting start to this lecture series than with a very distinguished academic who has made a great impact in the area of environmental law. So welcome very much, Professor Heinzerling. We all know that an event like this doesn't just happen. There are many people behind the scenes. And so I want to recognize Sean Lebar, he's still behind the scenes. Sean Lebar is the program director for the Getches-Wilkinson Center. Also, thanks go to Alice Madden, who is the executive director of the Getches-Wilkinson Center. Thank you very much, Alice. And there are several members of the Center's advisory council here in the audience tonight, so I'd like to recognize them. Could you all raise your hand? So thank you for your service and commitment to the Getches-Wilkinson Center. So with that, I'd like to now introduce Charles Wilkinson, a dear friend to me and to many of us in the room, distinguished professor emeritus, and he will now tell us a bit more about the Ruth Wright legacy and also introduce our speaker. So welcome, Charles.
Good evening. This is going to be a good one. I'll introduce our very honored guest from back east in a few minutes, but I would like now to make some comments to Boulder royalty. For those of you who are visiting, or for those of us who live here, I'd suggest there's something you could do every now and then. Take a moment, one of those moments we cherish when we just kind of slow down, and even if it's a couple of minutes, when you're in Boulder, look around. Up at the Flatirons, yes. Also the lower hills, a little further south, north. And the open plains the elegant open plains. And think about how they relate to the city and how it's a city in this splendor, it really is, that is kind of appropriate. It didn't overreach. Oh, we've got problems. We've got plenty of problems. But basically, the relationship between us and the natural world here, considering you're going to have a small city, a large town, feels like a darn good way to do it. And that reflection could be coupled with the fact that there once was a crisis. Boulder got discovered in the late 1960s, early 70s, and people could see there was a lot of ways to make money here as the nation was moving west. And what a place. And before you knew it, there were on the books, some of them tentatively approved by the city council, others been submitted, others deep into blueprints. There were a couple of dozen buildings pushing up to 140 feet. There was a 200-foot building proposed at the corner of Canyon and 9th Street. And that could have been just the beginning. Well, one person got mad. And much more importantly, she got determined. And to the everlasting glory of this law school, she was at that time a law student here. And she decided to do something about this. And she wrote a paper in a seminar on height limits. Now, that's kind of old stuff in environmental law now, but it wasn't then. And there were a lot of uncertainties about height limits and whether you could do them and how you could do them. And yeah, there was some Supreme Court precedent that helped, but it was controversial stuff, and there were legal objections being raised to any idea of a height limit. This is private property we're talking about. And then, having finished the paper that argued for the appropriateness of a height limit, Ruth, in the lead, but always collaborative and with plenty of people with her, took it to the city council for a 55-foot height limit. And oh, was it controversial. And did it ever take a bunch of city council meetings and votes? But the city council passed it. And of course, all of us, even us optimists, can't resist being cynical, and we know, of course, that there have been a bunch of exceptions made and softened it. Except that's never happened because it's sacred language, 55 feet. And at the same time, these early environmentalists, although the word really wasn't quite said that way yet, those early citizens of Boulder who saw what the future should be and loved this place and knew that it wasn't just an amenity, but that it was part of us. And they established a blue line, 5,700 feet, above which city water would not be allowed to new homes. And so when you look up there, not only are vistas, what a wonderful thing a vista is, but in addition, there are very few buildings. They were pre-1970 buildings. And so it's open space up there. And then, I think it may have been the first place in the country, but certainly it was done more ambitiously than anywhere else. Boulder passed a 4 mil, 4/10 of 1 cent, sales tax for open space. And so, when you look up at the mountains, you have a vista, and you have a natural area that you can look out to, and you have the open space that surrounds Boulder, not only for its beauty, but for its public recreation, whether it's biking or, oh my God, my dog loves it. Our use and for land health. And Ruth Wright was very busy there and has been called the mother of Boulder open space. Imagine being that and being the person who gave us our vistas. And so you can imagine how we at the center feel about naming this evening for now and forever after Ruth Wright. Could you stand up, Ruth? We are absolutely delighted to have Lisa Heinz, my own private experience with that is that I've read it probably 10,000 times. And it always seemed perfectly normal to me. And I've been saying it the last few days, and it came out. And then I started to say, what if I don't get it right? And I said, no, that couldn't be. Heinzerling. As a legal scholar, she's a true superstar. And in her 4 books and numerous articles, she put forth a large and influential body of scholarship in environmental and administrative law. She's had the rare and satisfying experience of clerking for Justice William Brennan and later being named to the Brennan Chair at Georgetown. She is a decorated teacher. Lisa has done critical work in the public sphere and has become one of the nation's most effective advocates for responding to climate change. During her tenure in the Massachusetts Attorney General's office, she was counsel of record for the states of Massachusetts and New Jersey in Whitman against American Trucking Association in 2001, where the court upheld a central program of the Clean Air Act on particulate matter against a constitutional challenge based on the non-delegation doctrine. A few years later, Lisa was approached and agreed to serve as counsel for the coalition of states that had brought Massachusetts against EPA when the EPA of the George W. Bush administration denied any authority to regulate greenhouse gases. She was the main strategist and the lead author of the briefs for that coalition's position that led to the landmark Supreme Court case that EPA did possess authority under the Clean Air Act. Lisa was a member of the transition team during the Obama administration in 2008, and for 1998, sorry, and for 2 years, 2008, and for 2 years served in special advisory positions in EPA, where her influence was widely known. But when the Obama administration strayed, she was quick and strong in criticizing the work of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, which has long revised and overturned regulations on technical grounds, thus thwarting the objectives of the substantive agencies. OIRA, Lisa has said, is where regulations go to die. Lisa has been in the forefront then in the critical ongoing debates over agency regulatory practices involving climate change, greenhouse gases, and other environmental concerns. Decisions often turn on aspects of cost-benefit analysis. As you will see from the summary of this talk, Lisa will be addressing those matters tonight, and we certainly are looking forward to it. Let us welcome Lisa.
Thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. Thank you, Charles, for that introduction. Thank you, Ruth Wright, for endowing this lecture and for your remarkable public service. I am really pleased to be here at the University of Colorado. I am a great fan of your environmental faculty, and I've long admired your environmental program. When I think of your faculty, I think of your vibrant personalities and your deep commitment to the environment. You all inspire me. So thank you for inviting me here. I love the fact that you are all here at 6 o'clock on a Friday night to hear about cost-benefit analysis. You have no idea how much that warms my heart. And I'm going to talk for a while, right? I'm going to talk. I was asked to speak for 45 minutes. I'm going to speak for 45 minutes. And so I thought, as a kindness to you, I'd tell you where I'm going so that you can know when you're closer to the reception that follows the talk, right? My talk is going to have 4 parts. It's also going to have a conclusion that I think you might not like. Right? So the 4 parts are as follows. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to explain how, over several decades, cost-benefit analysis came to dominate in federal environmental decision-making. Next, I'm going to explain why I believe cost-benefit analysis is a misguided way to make environmental decisions. Third, I'll discuss how the Obama administration approached these issues. Fourth, I'm going to describe how in the Trump administration, cost-benefit analysis has mutated into cost-nothing analysis. Cost-nothing analysis, my term, is analysis in which only costs and not benefits matter, and in which the overriding assumption is that it costs us nothing to discard policies aimed at protecting human health and the environment. I'm going to conclude by tracing the relationship between our current environmental predicament and the decades of presidential politics leading up to it. I will suggest to you that even though the current administration's approach to environmental policy is indeed extreme in its unrelenting deregulatory thrust, and in its flat-out denial of the benefits of environmental protection, this approach is a predictable consequence of our decades-long acceptance of an overly powerful presidency, one in which our presidents have long asserted the power to substitute their own economic theories for the decision-making criteria Congress has specified in our environmental laws. So first, how did cost-benefit analysis come to dominate environmental policy? The short answer is that presidents by fiat simply made it so. All of our major federal environmental statutes were passed in a single decade, from New Year's Day in 1970, when President Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act into law, to December 1980, when the Superfund law was passed as President Jimmy Carter was about to leave office. None of these statutes installed cost-benefit analysis as its decision-making framework. Indeed, to this day, the only federal statute that explicitly embraces the formal cost-benefit method I will discuss tonight is a single provision of the Safe Drinking Water Act added to the statute in 1996. At many statutory decision points, Congress looked cost-benefit analysis in the eye and said, no, thank you. Even in the face of these statutes, however, presidents for decades have measured the wisdom of major environmental policies according to a cost-benefit metric. They have embraced a process of White House review of environmental rules that insists that major rules pass a cost-benefit test. They have pressed agencies to adopt legal interpretations consistent with their economic theories. The practice of White House review of agency rules goes back as far as President Richard Nixon, as far back, in other words, as the modern era of environmental law. In environmental circles, President Nixon is known as the president who created the Environmental Protection Agency. He was in office when the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act were passed. Some even regard him as the first environmental president. We should remember, though, that he did veto the Clean Water Act, and when Congress overrode that veto, he tried to impound the funds Congress had appropriated for addressing water pollution. The Supreme Court eventually held that he could not impound this money. But presidents from Nixon on have exercised power over environmental policy in another way, by requiring that major regulatory initiatives be reviewed by and approved by the White House. Presidents from Nixon to Carter embraced some form of White House review of agency rules. The practice of White House regulatory review didn't really take off, however, until President Ronald Reagan came into office. In one of his first acts, President Reagan, who of course famously said government is the problem, issued an executive order requiring agencies to submit major rules to the White House before issuing them. This executive order provided that any regulation that would cost more than $100 million per year must be accompanied by a cost-benefit analysis. President Reagan later designated the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within the Office of Management and Budget as the entity responsible for overseeing the White House process of regulatory review. And with that, we were off and running toward a regulatory system with two striking and problematic features: First, the president and his aides in the White House would become the deciders when it came to important regulatory policies. Second, cost-benefit analysis would be the decision-making criterion they would deploy in reviewing these policies. Surprisingly, this basic structure has persisted since that time across presidents of different political parties and different regulatory philosophies. All presidents since Reagan have found it in their interests to exert control over executive agencies' regulatory choices and to use cost-benefit analysis as their decision-making tool. Presidents from Clinton on have indeed approached this matter so consistently that they've found it in their interests to retain President Clinton's own executive order on regulatory review. To this day, President Clinton's executive order prescribing the basic structure and criteria for White House review of agency rules remains in place. Even President Trump, who, as you may know, is not shy about issuing executive orders and revoking prior ones, has not withdrawn the Clinton-era executive review order on regulatory review. Presidents have maintained this system in the face of what I regard as two significant legal obstacles. The first is that our environmental statutes, with very, very few exceptions, do not identify the president as the decision maker with respect to environmental policy. Instead, they identify agencies or agency heads as the decision makers. The Clean Air Act, for example, specifically identifies the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency as the person who decides how strict our national ambient air quality standards will be and whether a specific air pollutant endangers public health or welfare. The statute does not identify the president as the person who decides these things. It certainly does not identify aides in the White House or staff in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs as the people who decide these things. Nor do other environmental statutes identify these people as the environmental deciders. Of course, proponents of the constitutional theory of the unitary executive would say that Congress may not prevent the president from exercising complete control over the administrative agencies, including control over the specific regulatory decisions they make. But the Supreme Court has never, at least not yet, so held. For now, at least, there remains a legal question as to why the president and his aides in the White House are making decisions that Congress has delegated to other personnel in the executive branch. The second legal problem with the current practice of White House regulatory review is that most environmental laws do not install cost-benefit analysis as the relevant decision-making criterion. In fact, as I noted earlier, only a single environmental protection statute explicitly embraces formal cost-benefit analysis as a decision-making tool. This is the provision of the Safe Drinking Water Act that authorizes EPA to consider quantitative cost-benefit analysis in developing maximum contaminant levels for pollutants in drinking water. No other environmental law explicitly embraces the kind of economic analysis that presidents have required for regulatory decisions. There is an obvious wrinkle here. Although only one statute explicitly embraces cost-benefit analysis, many statutes are ambiguous or arguably ambiguous on this point. And during the same period when cost-benefit analysis was being embraced by presidents across political parties and regulatory philosophies, the executive branch also came to enjoy a great deal of judicial deference to its interpretive choices. This deference comes, of course, from the famous Chevron doctrine, which holds that courts will defer to an agency's reasonable interpretation of a statute it is charged with administering. Under Chevron, if a statute is ambiguous on the relevance of cost-benefit analysis to environmental decisions, a reasonable choice in either direction will be upheld by the courts. And so it came to pass that some agency decisions applying a cost-benefit test in the environmental context were judicially approved. For example, in a case called Entergy versus Riverkeeper, the Supreme Court upheld EPA's decision to apply a cost-benefit test to a rule under the Clean Water Act. The Chevron principle could have led in either direction, either toward or away from cost-benefit analysis of environmental decisions. However, presidential directives to the environmental agencies have run in only one direction, toward interpretations that install cost-benefit analysis as the decision-making criterion. Presidents' collective enthusiasm for cost-benefit analysis meant that even in Democratic administrations sympathetic to environmental protection, the legal system's reliance on cost-benefit analysis waxed rather than waned. Consider the Obama administration. The Obama White House strengthened the dominance of cost-benefit analysis in environmental policy by insisting at every opportunity on interpretations of environmental statutes embracing cost-benefit tests. In other words, the Obama White House pressed the agencies that implement environmental statutes to exercise their interpretive discretion in favor of adopting cost-benefit analysis as their decision-making criterion. This move closed, to some extent, the legal gap I mentioned earlier. That is, the gap between the environmental statute's inherent embrace of criteria other than cost-benefit analysis and the widespread adoption of cost-benefit analysis as a method for evaluating environmental policy. The problem from my perspective is that this pressure from the White House often came in the face of indications that Congress had chosen to reject cost-benefit analysis as the decision-making tool, and furthermore, it came from officials whom Congress had not charged with making the environmental decisions in question. The accretion of power in the presidency, the power to direct and countermand particular decisions made by the very officials charged by Congress with making them, thus combined with agencies' interpretive discretion under Chevron to make cost-benefit analysis the dominating decision-making criteria for environmental policy. The Supreme Court then took this trend to another level when, in a case called Michigan versus EPA, it held that EPA had erred in declining to interpret an important provision of the Clean Air Act to embrace cost-benefit balancing. The key statutory term in Michigan versus EPA was appropriate. EPA had erred, Justice Scalia wrote for the court, in interpreting the word appropriate to give it discretion not to consider costs in deciding whether to regulate air emissions, toxic air emissions from power plants. We will be sorting out the cost-benefit implications of the court's decision for many years. Thus far, I've tried to explain how cost-benefit analysis came to dominate decisions on environmental policy, despite Congress's failure to embrace this method in our environmental laws. But what you might be thinking is wrong with cost-benefit analysis. Isn't it only rational to consider the balance of costs and benefits in making important decisions? Now I'd like to explain why I think cost-benefit analysis is not a good way of making important decisions about the environment. To preview, I believe that cost-benefit analysis loads the dice against ambitious environmental protection, and this is why I think it's a bad way to make environmental decisions. To understand why I think this, you need to know something about cost-benefit analysis. As its name suggests, and as I'm sure you know, cost-benefit analysis proceeds by comparing the economic costs of a policy to its economic benefits. A policy passes a cost-benefit test when its benefits exceed its costs. Technically, the state of affairs in which benefits exceed costs is known as Calder-Hicks efficiency, for the economists who championed this criterion. The idea behind Calder-Hicks efficiency is that a decision is efficient if the winners in the decision could compensate the losers. Importantly, however, the winners need not actually compensate the losers. The analysis simply needs to show that, in theory, they could do so. Notice, then, that the losers don't need to come out ahead. Indeed, they can come out very much behind. Moreover, the winners can be highly concentrated and very few in number. The pie might get bigger, but the pieces all might go to just a few people. The consequences for fairness and equity of this efficiency criterion should be obvious. While presidents, particularly in Democratic administrations, have been careful to give occasional shout-outs to fairness and equity as important considerations in regulatory policy, these considerations have almost never played a decisive part once cost-benefit analysis gets rolling. So understand this. When you embrace cost-benefit analysis, as a decision-making criterion, you are embracing a method that shunts fairness to the side in its pursuit of overall wealth. As environmental law is judged more and more by its ability to provide clean air, clean water, and clean land to all of our people, the efficiency criterion of cost-benefit analysis seems to me ever more behind the times. Other aspects of the cost-benefit method also disfavor ambitious environmental protection. Cost-benefit analysis requires the quantification and monetization of the significant costs and benefits of environmental decisions. Although identifying even just the economics costs of any given policy can be challenging, the real troubles appear in an attempt to fit human health and the environment into an economic equation. Serious problems begin to emerge even at the very first step of cost-benefit analysis, and that is the step of quantifying the benefits. Many of the benefits of environmental protection defy quantification. These benefits span an enormous range, from human life and health to ecosystems and species to crops and property to values like freedom, fairness, and community. In any given cost-benefit analysis, one will usually find that significant categories of benefits simply cannot even be quantified. When they are not quantified, their effective value drops to zero in the resulting analysis. They become like an afterthought. Examples of this dynamic could be multiplied. One of my favorites, or sort of anti-favorites, comes from a cost-benefit analysis of a rule protecting roadless areas in national forests. For this rule, issued during the Clinton administration, the government estimated the benefit to be $219,000. I love the precision of that. This benefit reflected the cost that would be saved. Listen, the cost that would be saved because the roads that would otherwise have been built would not need to be maintained, right? That's right. The quantified and monetized benefit of protecting pristine areas in national forests was the money saved by not maintaining roads. The government also noted that the roadless area protection rule would protect air and water quality, recreational opportunities, and wildlife habitat, but it could not quantify these benefits. Yet these were the very reasons for the protecting roadless areas in the first place. The reasons for protecting roadless areas were the very things that could not even be quantified. This is not an unusual state of affairs. Thus, even at the very first step of cost-benefit analysis, quantification, important values can just drop out of the picture. The second step of cost-benefit analysis is also vexing. At this stage, the quantified benefits are monetized. That is, they're translated into dollar values. Even when benefits can be quantified, translating them into dollars, that is, translating into monetary values benefits such as human lives saved, illnesses averted, and species protected, is, to say the least, challenging. One might think that the most challenging of these operations would be the monetization of life itself. How could the government place a monetary value on human life? To put the point more precisely, how could the government, in considering whether to restrict human conduct that kills people, identify a financial level at which it becomes appropriate simply and consciously to allow that conduct to continue rather than taking action to change it? In thinking through the problem of valuing human life, economists faced another conundrum. The way economists typically value regulatory benefits is to ask either how much money people are willing to pay to obtain the benefits, or how much money they're willing to accept as compensation for foregoing the benefits. The idea is to figure out what would happen in an actual economic market. In a market, what value would individuals voluntarily place on the benefits of environmental protection? When it comes to death, however, this is not a very helpful question. If you ask a person how much she's willing to pay to avoid certain death, she will likely pay up to the very limit of her financial resources. She will pay whatever she can pay to avoid certain death. The willingness to pay, thus, in this context, measures not willingness to pay, at all, but only capacity to pay. It'll measure not how much she values her life, but how much money she has. If, on the other hand, you ask a person how much she is willing to accept as compensation for accepting certain death, right? Ask her how much compensation she will demand for you to kill her. She will likely tell you to go away. She probably won't be that nice about it. She'll tell you that she will not accept any amount of money for certain death. In refusing the deal, she's refusing to take part in the kind of market transaction that serves as the model for the behavior evaluated in cost-benefit analysis. In order to put a value on human life, therefore, in regulation, economists needed to try a different tack. They could not ask a question about the value of certain death. So they instead asked a question about the risk of death. They found that people do indeed pay to avoid small risks of death, and that people do indeed accept compensation in order to take on such risks. They found that they could aggregate these small amounts of money to reflect the total amount a group of people would pay to or accept to avoid or accept one death in their group. They called the resulting monetary value the value of a statistical life. A statistical life is the life we lose when a collection of small risks to humans produces a death. The value of a statistical life is the amount of money we would be willing to pay or accept to avoid or accept that loss of life. To put the point concretely, suppose that 1 million people all face a risk, 1 in 1 million risk of death from being exposed to a particular air pollutant. Suppose these people are each willing to pay $10 to avoid that 1 in a million risk. All told, this population is willing to pay $10 million to avoid one death from the air pollution. In this case, we'd say that the value of the statistical life is $10 million. Simple, right? In this way, economists avoided the puzzle of valuing certain death. They defined the value being measured as a statistical life rather than a certain identified life. In this way, they also, as it happens, produced a respectably large value for deaths that arise due to environmental threats. As it happens, the going value for statistical lives, as estimated by the US government, is about $10 million. I used this nice round number to illustrate the concept of a statistical life, but in fact, it's also about the same amount of money agencies use today in valuing mortality risks. But even the $10 million figure might be too low. This value comes from studies of the labor market in which workers supposedly are knowingly and voluntarily trading off risks for money. That is, they are knowingly and voluntarily accepting workplace risks in exchange for higher wages. This calculus leaves out other populations, such as children, who do not participate in the labor market and whose value to us might not be the same as the value we attach to adults of working age. The calculus also makes what I regard as a rather heroic assumption that workers in risky jobs not only know and understand the precise risks they face on the job, but also that they voluntarily accept those risks in return for money, and not because their employment choices are limited by economic circumstances, geographic constraints, racial, ethnic, or gender discrimination, or other factors that might limit their ability to bargain for a better trade-off between risk and money. Even if the roughly $10 million value for statistical lives is perfectly consistent, however, with our knowing and voluntary preferences, there remains the task of monetizing the many other benefits of environmental protection. Constraints here include the mundane but ever-present limits on government's time and resources. Often we cannot attach dollar values to the benefits of environmental policy, not because it's impossible to do so, but because time and resources do not permit further intricate analysis. In other cases, attaching a dollar value to regulatory benefits may misconceive the very benefits under review. Consider the Obama administration's cost-benefit analysis of measures to reduce the incidence of rape and other forms of sexual abuse in prisons. These measures were required by the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and the measures were to be embodied in a rule. The Department of Justice produced an economic analysis that cataloged 17 different types of rape and sexual abuse and attached a dollar value to each. The monetary values supposedly reflected the amount of compensation victims of rape or abuse would require to accept rape or sexual abuse, or the amount of money the victims would pay to avoid rape or sexual abuse. The treatment of rape and sexual abuse as market transactions, and as voluntary market transactions at that, deeply misconceives the nature of the relevant harms. By the brute force of economic logic, it transforms violence and subordination into just another day at the market. Despite the profound limitations of the cost-benefit framework, an environmental regulation that averts a significant number of quantified human deaths actually stands a fair chance of passing a cost-benefit test. The unfortunate corollary is, however, that in practice an environmental regulation that does not avert a significant number of quantified human deaths stands a poor chance of passing a cost-benefit test. We can see this by comparing the cost-benefit fates of air pollution rules to those of rules on water pollution and toxic substances. Most of our recent air pollution rules reduce particulate matter pollution, even if their direct regulatory target is a different kind of air pollution. Particulate matter kills people in significant numbers. The quantified deaths, multiplied by the $10 million price tag I've described, allow most air pollution rules to pass a cost-benefit test. In fact, in 20 years of compiling reports on cost-benefit analyses done by administrative agencies, the Office of Management and Budget has found that all major air pollution rules, save 3, have passed a cost-benefit test. Yet few water pollution rules have even made it out of the White House, and those few that have made it out have done so despite mostly failing the cost-benefit test. The same goes for rules on toxic substances. The reason is that EPA has not, for the most part, linked water pollution to quantified human deaths. And with respect to toxic substances, the quantified human deaths that may be associated with those substances are usually related to cancer, which has a long latency period, which is discounted severely according to a technique I'm about to describe. So, by making environmental rules pass a cost-benefit test, presidents have in practice substantially tilted the regulatory field in favor of air pollution rules, specifically air pollution rules that reduce particulate matter, and against rules aimed at water pollution and toxic substances. I have nothing against air pollution rules. I very much appreciate air pollution rules that reduce particulate matter. I just don't think that that's all we have to protect when we protect the environment in this country. Even when the hurdles of quantification and monetization can be overcome, a third standard feature of cost economic analysis erects yet another obstacle to environmental protection. Cost-benefit analysts insist upon discounting future benefits to present value. Discounting is effectively compound interest in reverse. It applies rates of return on financial investments backwards to the present day from the moment in the future when the benefits are expected to occur. However, instead of magically turning a small sum of money into a gigantic amount today, into a gigantic amount of money in the future, as compound interest does, discounting magically turns a gigantic amount of money in the future into a trivial amount of money today. This step in cost-benefit analysis has the effect of greatly shrinking the perceived benefits of policies that address future harms, which is exactly what many, if not most, environmental policies aim to do. Through quantification, monetization, and discounting, cost-benefit analysis rigs the game against protective environmental policies. Although we're often told that cost-benefit analysis is the only rational way to approach important decisions, and that the science of economic analysis demands the kinds of anti-regulatory techniques I've described. In fact, cost-benefit analysis has embedded within it large and contestable choices about values. Discounting, for example, makes a brute force assumption that the future is simply not worth very much to us. Yet the relative worth of the present and the future is a choice of profound moral significance. The operation of discounting seems technical, but the choices embedded within it are anything but. Now, despite this very powerful critique of cost-benefit analysis that I've just offered you, and which I've hammered away at for years in my life as an academic, cost-benefit analysis has not only survived, it's thrived. Right? And in fact, as Charles mentioned, several years after my book criticizing cost-benefit analysis was published, in a strange and wonderful twist of fate, I found myself in the surprising position of running the Environmental Protection Agency office that oversees economic analysis within the agency. In the first 2 years of the Obama administration, first as an advisor to EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson, and then as Associate Administrator of EPA's Office of Policy, I oversaw the production of the kinds of economic analyses I had spent much of my academic career criticizing. You can imagine the economists' glee when my appointment was announced. Within days of entering office, President Obama issued a presidential memorandum that directed the Office of Management and Budget to consult with the regulatory agencies and make recommendations to the president for a new executive order on regulatory review. President Obama's memorandum noted that a lot had been learned since 1993 when Clinton's executive order was issued, about both the substance of regulation and about how to improve the process of regulatory review. In this time of fundamental transformation, President Obama declared that process, the regulatory review process, and the principles governing regulation in general should be revisited. Agencies and the public responded with enthusiasm. Many endorsed the idea of remaking the process and substance of regulatory review. They offered comments about how to do this, and then they waited. Within the EPA, I found myself having to explain over and over that while we waited for to see what the president would do to remake the process of regulatory review, the framework set in the Clinton-era executive order still governed our work. That framework, as I've noted, required major rules to be reviewed and approved by the White House and required the most important rules to be accompanied by a cost-benefit analysis. When 2 years into his first term, President Obama finally produced an executive order on regulatory review, it disappointed those who had hoped for a change from prior practice. The executive order in significant part simply repeated, often word for word, the process and substance of Clinton's executive order. In fact, it left Clinton's executive order entirely in place. The Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs remained the president's designated gatekeeper for all major rules, and cost-benefit analysis remained the official decision-making criterion. Moreover, the Obama White House exerted forceful, sometimes picayune, control over the work of the environmental agencies. If the White House designee for regulatory review, OIRA, wanted to review any of EPA's regulatory initiatives, it reviewed them. Although the Clinton-era executive order by its terms applies only to regulations, OIRA also reviewed any guidance documents they wanted to see. OIRA also took an expansive view of the kinds of regulatory actions that warranted White House review. Any regulatory action OIRA wanted to see was perforce, in the words of the Clinton-era executive order, a novel legal or policy matter that justified White House review. At the same time, agencies were pressed to interpret the statutes they administered to embrace a cost-benefit test, as I've said. Beyond regulatory actions, OIRA staff took it upon themselves to reach deep into EPA's civil service apparatus, watching EPA's webpage and outside publications for any hint that EPA was up to something that the White House had not weighed in on. Even talks by career civil servants at professional conferences could inspire scolding phone calls about EPA's actions and positions. Political operatives at the White House and within the agency also controlled civil servants' interactions with the media, requiring press office minders for interviews with reporters. Leaks to the press were simply not on. In addition, the Obama administration took the cost-benefit desideratum extremely seriously. After he left office as President Obama's first head of OIRA, law professor Cass Sunstein wrote a book about his experience. He observed that if a rule got into trouble at OIRA, it was usually because it had failed the cost-benefit test. As a result of this test, as I've noted, rules on water pollution and toxic chemicals fared poorly. These rules lacked the silver bullet that had come to dominate cost-benefit analysis of air pollution rules. They did not reduce particulate matter. The Obama administration was willing to let certain kinds of environmental regulations go by the board, specifically regulations targeting water pollution and toxic chemicals, because they did not have positive cost-benefit profiles. Even where specific kinds of environmental regulations were consistent with overall administration policy, the Obama administration embraced the technical features of cost-benefit analysis that would undercut such rules. Consider the Obama administration's approach to climate change and discounting. Early on, the administration convened an interagency working group to develop a social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon is, as the group described it, the monetized damages associated with an incremental increase in carbon emissions in a given year. This figure is, the group also wrote, intended to include but is not limited to changes in net agricultural productivity, human health, property damages from increased flood risk, and the value of ecosystem services due to climate change. The analysis of the social cost of carbon looked out almost 300 years into the future, through the year 2300, and tried to encapsulate the consequences for human health and welfare of the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Discounting played a gigantic role in this analysis due to the very long time frames involved. In setting a social cost of carbon to be used in federal cost-benefit analysis, the Obama administration picked a range of 2.5 to 5% as the discount rate, with a central value of 3%. The choice of a discount rate had enormous consequences. Indeed, in some scenarios employing the 5% discount rate, the social cost of carbon actually turned into a social benefit. Some of the scenarios using this discount rate estimated that there would be overall benefits rather than overall costs from climate change. The idea that carbon dioxide was actually good for us over the long term was inconsistent with the thrust of the scientific evidence on the adverse and possibly catastrophic effects of climate change. Yet in these scenarios, the Obama administration embraced the economic of discounting over the scientific evidence of catastrophic change. Even in the scenarios using lower discount rates, the rates used, 2.5 and 3%, were high enough to have profound effects on the perceived benefit of reducing carbon dioxide emissions. Thus, when President Obama left office, he left for the new president a legacy of presidential control over regulatory policies and interpretive choices, and a tradition of enthusiasm for a particular kind of economic analysis and its equity-blind criterion of efficiency. President Obama handed to his predecessor, his successor, undiminished, a legacy of presidential control over environmental policy in which the control is exercised by embedding a particular economic theory in the day-to-day operations of the environmental agencies. In President Trump's hands, this legacy has become a one-way road to environmental destruction. President Trump has exercised broad and deep control over the environmental agencies. He has, through executive order, instructed the agencies to revisit just about every major environmental initiative of the Obama era. His political appointees in the agencies have retaliated against career civil servants deemed hostile to his political agenda. The agencies have proposed to revoke numerous environmental rules, not only by explaining that they are not consistent with the policies of this administration, but by claiming that the relevant agencies actually never had the statutory authority to issue them in the first place. In other words, as has happened with every other president since Richard Nixon, this administration has further tightened the president's control over regulatory policy. The current administration has changed course, however, with respect to the nature of the economic analysis it deploys. President Trump has not revoked the Clinton-era executive order on White House regulatory review, and in this administration, OIRA has reviewed numerous agency rules under the umbrella of this order. Yet the nature of economic analysis has changed significantly. In this administration analysis, as I've said, cost-benefit analysis has mutated into cost-nothing analysis. In cost-nothing analysis, only costs and not benefits count. And the analysis proceeds, as I've said, on the assumption that we lose nothing when we do not protect human health and the environment. One can see this species of analysis most clearly in President Trump's executive order entitled Reducing Regulation and Controlling Regulatory Costs. This executive order, known for good reason as the 2-for-1 order, instructed agencies to revoke 2 existing rules for every new rule they issued. The order also instructed the Office of Management and Budget to set regulatory budgets for the agencies, budgets that set a limit not on the public funds that agencies may spend, but on the private expenditures the agencies may impose through regulation. For fiscal year 2019, OMB has set regulatory budgets for the agencies that are either 0 or negative. This means that in order to issue new rules with new regulatory costs, agencies must offset the new costs by undoing existing rules. The only considerations of relevance to the agency's regulatory budgets are the costs that regulations impose on regulated entities. Irrelevant to this analysis are the benefits of regulation. Thus has cost-benefit analysis mutated by executive directive into cost-nothing analysis. The mutation of cost-benefit into cost-nothing has spread to agencies' public explanations for their regulatory decisions. A fundamental principle of administrative law is that agencies must explain in reasoned terms their decisions. They must explain their reasons for issuing new rules, and they must explain their reasons for revoking or changing existing rules. In doing so, they may not ignore important aspects of the problems before them. The Trump administration, however, has preferred cost-nothing analysis over a fair appraisal of the full consequences of its regulatory choices. In the early months of the administration, agencies delayed and suspended many dozens of rules from the Obama administration, often with little more explanation than that the administration had changed hands. The one-sided analysis offered by the agencies met with hostility in the courts. The administration has lost numerous cases because it refused to grapple with the health or environmental consequences of its delays. As the administration moves to the next phase of its deregulatory program, which involves the actual revocation of existing rules rather than their mere delay, it has not clearly come to terms with the lessons of the early judicial defeats. Agencies continue to lean hard on the cost side of the equation and to ignore the benefits of the rules they propose to renounce. Just last week, for example, as the comment period of the administration's rollback of fuel efficiency standards came to a close, scores of organizations filed comments excoriating the almost risibly sloppy and biased analysis on which the rollback was based. Perhaps it's with judicial review in mind, therefore, that the administration has begun to engage in a wholesale effort to make the benefits of environmental regulation simply disappear. If there are no regulatory benefits, perhaps the courts can't fault the agencies for ignoring them. Here, the administration proposes not simply to look the other way, but to wipe the benefits off the books completely. The administration is accomplishing this disappearing feat in several ways. First, the administration is proposing to disregard studies if the data behind those studies are not made available to the public. The data from the epidemiological studies that undergird many environmental standards often are intertwined with confidential patient information that may not be publicly shared without violating rules for patient confidentiality. EPA has proposed, nevertheless, to stop relying on such studies unless their underlying data are made publicly available. A clear target of this proposal is the body of epidemiological research, concluding that particulate matter kills people and makes them sick. As I noted earlier, these quantified harms explain the highly positive cost-benefit profiles of many rules on air pollution. In a proposal cynically touting scientific transparency, EPA has proposed to censor this scientific evidence. One way to make benefits disappear, apparently, is simply to declare that the evidence showing benefits is inadmissible. A second way the administration is making benefits disappear is by disregarding the co-benefits of regulatory decisions. Co-benefits, also known as ancillary benefits, are the positive consequences that come from a regulation, yet are not the direct aim of the regulation. The technologies that control emissions of toxic substances like mercury and lead from power plants, for example, also control the emissions of particulate matter. EPA has long counted these particulate matter co-benefits in its cost-benefit analyses of air pollution rules. In a memorandum discussing potential changes to EPA's cost-benefit analysis, however, then Administrator Scott Pruitt called out the agency's long-standing practice of relying on co-benefits and indicated that this practice was ripe for change. Recently, Acting Administrator Andrew Wheeler sent a related proposal to the White House that we expect will also make the co-benefits of these air pollution rules disappear. The proposal to ignore co-benefits in determining whether air pollution standards meet cost-benefit tests conflicts with long-standing policy and practice of the Environmental Protection Agency, with long-standing guidance from the Office of Management and Budget, and I think actually with common sense. The benefits don't disappear from the world because the EPA administrator has written a memo. The administration is erasing benefits in another way as well. In developing the social cost of carbon in the Obama administration, the interagency working group focused not only on the effects of climate change in this country, but also on its effects elsewhere in the world. The idea was that climate change is a global problem and that effects that occur elsewhere in the world also affect us here. By contrast, the Trump administration has chosen to ignore the global consequences of climate change and to focus only on domestic effects. The Trump administration has thus employed a two-part economic strategy for defending deregulation. It has, by sheer brute force, delayed or proposed to revoke existing rules by simply citing only to the costs of regulation and shunting to the side the benefits. It has also set about making the erasure of these benefits official government policy. In these ways, it's transforming cost-benefit analysis into cost-nothing analysis. I regard these as highly unfortunate developments. Let me stress that the specific form of these developments has been distinctive to the current administration. Nevertheless, I would like to close by identifying the relationship between current developments and past practices. For decades, we have watched as each president we elect accretes more power to himself and to his aides in the White House. We have watched as presidents have asserted ever greater authority to micromanage decisions statutorily committed to other executive branch officers and institutions. We have watched as presidents, in the face of statutes embracing other decision-making criteria, have embraced economic efficiency as the desideratum of regulatory policy. We have watched as certain environmental problems, such as water pollution and exposure to toxic substances, have festered because rules addressing them have failed the cost-benefit test. We have watched, without any apparent curiosity or alarm, as the reduction of particulate matter in the air has become the core driver of environmental policy in this country, as if the reduction of particulate matter in the air is the only thing environmental policy is for. We could watch the unraveling of environmental policy at this moment and simply respond that the administration has gotten its economic analysis wrong. It's ignored the benefit side of the regulatory equation, and it has proposed to erase categories of benefits that economic science recognizes. I believe the problem is deeper than this. The president simply has too much power. and has had too much power for decades. Ceding control to the president and his aides in the White House disrespects the delegations Congress has made to the agencies and to agency personnel. Likewise, the criterion of economic efficiency does not jibe with the mission of our environmental laws. The technique of cost-benefit analysis has always, even before now, left too much on the cutting room floor, including consequences that cannot easily be counted and consequences that reach into the far future. Cost-benefit analysis has never been the environmentalist's friend. We can decry, as I do, the present turn toward cost-nothing analysis, but we should also reckon with our long-standing tolerance of presidents' substitution of their own economic theories for the environmental imperatives our laws embrace. Thank you.